The autumn that introduced Elena Moore to the next version of her life arrived on a hush of rain and red maples along Commonwealth Avenue, where the city looked older than its years and far kinder than its gossip. Elena had spent the morning kneeling on a carpet scattered with picture cards and phone letters at the pediatric clinic where she worked as a children's speech therapist, coaxing syllables out of stubborn shyness and stuttering courage. She loved that work more than she ever admitted, and those small victories, cat, truck, mama, she felt the spine of the world quietly repair itself. Home was a tidy second-floor walk-up in Jamaica Plain that carried the scent of rosemary and lemon from the herb pots she lined on the windowsill. Her weekday evenings were a patchwork of long walks around Jamaica Pond, slow-cooked dinners, and phone calls from her mother, Caroline, who always began with, "Tell me something good," as if joy could be summoned by invitation. Elena's younger sister, Sophie, rarely called. She preferred cinematic entrances, brunches she arrived at 40 minutes late, and birthdays where she outshone the cake. Elena never begrudged her the brightness, at least not aloud. But she remembered childhood like a two-sided scarf. On one side, sleepovers in a bunk bed where secrets glowed in the dark. On the other, Sophie's crouched whisper at 13. "You always get first place because you're boring enough to deserve it," a sentence that had somehow lodged in the architecture of Elena's self-doubt. Their father, Robert, a retired paramedic with piano-player hands, called them my compass and my weather, and even he understood that the forecast between the sisters could change without warning. Still, when the rain let up and the sky peeled open like a fresh page, Elena packed a canvas tote with returns and set out for the Copley Square Library, oblivious to how many stories begin with a simple decision to go somewhere you've gone 100 times before. Libraries had been safe rooms for her since childhood, places where the hush wasn't emptiness but possibility, where the city's noise gentled at the threshold. The marble lions at the entrance, imperious and patient, seemed to nod as she passed under their watch. On the third floor, where afternoon light slanted through high windows and turned dust to glitter, a community showcase was underway, Boston Reimagined, students and recent grads pitching proposals for pocket parks, after-school spaces, and neighborhood restorations. Elena didn't come for the presentations, but the first slide caught her, a sketch of a public courtyard woven through with play structures and quiet nooks, designed not to contain children but to invite them, to climb, to read, to listen. The presenter, a man with wind-tossed brown hair and a suit that looked like it had been ironed by conviction rather than steam, spoke without the pomp she expected from architectural ambition. "Kids need corners that make them brave," he said, and Elena, who had spent all day building bravery out of sounds, felt her attention lean forward as if gravity had shifted. When he finished, polite applause rose, and a woman in the audience asked about cost, a man muttered about zoning, and Elena, heart steady but curious, drifted toward the display boards. He was there, pinning a stray edge of paper back with a clip that had lost its spring. "It keeps escaping," he said, half to himself. "Most good ideas do," she answered, and he smiled up at her, something lit behind his eyes. "Nathan," he offered, extending a hand. "Elena," she replied, and when their hands met, the marble lions downstairs might as well have blinked. What followed was neither thunderclap nor violin swell, only the plain surprise of conversation that kept refusing to end. Nathan Carter had grown up in Dorchester, raised by a mother who worked nights and taught him to find grace in second-hand things. He talked about remodeling a neighbor's porch one summer with scrap wood and borrowed tools, and how he learned that attention is its own kind of wealth. He asked Elena what brought her to the library, and she told him about her kids at the clinic, the boy who communicated with train whistles, the girl who arranged words in stacks like blocks and knocked them down when she got scared. He listened in a way that made room. Somewhere in the blue hour between afternoon and evening, he admitted he was between full-time anchors, consulting on small builds, drafting competition entries, chasing a firm that would see what he could do instead of what he lacked. Elena recognized the humility behind the ambition, and because she did, she didn't push when he sidestepped a question about his father with a practiced shrug. They wandered from boards to stacks to a corner table, where the library's silence grew companionable. Outside, Boston rethreaded itself in headlights and puddles. Inside, a librarian announced closing in 15 minutes, as if the night might expire without warning. "Do you come to these events often?" Nathan asked, wincing at the cliché even as he said it. "Only on rainy days that think they're omens," she said, surprising herself with the answer. He laughed, low and honest. They exchanged numbers without ceremony, a simple "so we can finish the conversation we started." As Elena stepped back into the damp brightness of Boylston Street, she felt not swept away but steadied, as if an unfamiliar shoreline had come into view. She did not know the currents waiting beneath, jealousies that still remembered their steps, fortunes that shapeshift, truths that will wear many faces before one is believed. She only knew that when a door opens gently, you notice the air it lets in. Nathan Carter's apartment in Dorchester was a modest second-floor walk-up with creaky floors, a window that refused to close all the way, and a view of the corner store where the owner, Mr. DeLuca, still wrote receipts by hand. It wasn't much, but it was his, and for a long time, that was enough. He had grown up in the same neighborhood, in a smaller place with paint peeling in the stairwell and heat that came and went like a moody friend. His mother, Margaret, had raised him alone after his father, Gregory Carter, left when Nathan was 6. She worked 2 jobs, days at a nursing home, nights at a diner, returning home smelling faintly of disinfectant and coffee. From her, Nathan inherited the belief that hard work could fix anything, though life had already shown him that belief wasn't always enough. He wasn't the kind of child who got in trouble. He was the kind who lingered after class to help clean the chalkboard or stayed up past midnight sketching houses on scrap paper. Architecture, to Nathan, was more than buildings. It was the idea of giving shape to something better, more lasting. He carried a tattered notebook everywhere, filling it with sketches of storefronts, bridges, even reimagined bus stops. That notebook had been his compass for years, a place where he could imagine himself into rooms he didn't yet have the key to. In high school, Nathan's talent began to attract attention. A summer volunteer program run by a local nonprofit paired him with an old carpenter named Frank Leary, who believed in teaching by doing. Nathan learned to handle a hammer, measure twice, cut once, and most importantly, to look at a structure and see the story it was telling. By 17, he was redesigning the front steps of the community center, and when they were built, the pride in Margaret's eyes was worth more than the small stipend he earned. But success was always tempered by the reality of his circumstances. College meant loans, working part-time jobs, and living lean. His first year at Boston Architectural College was a baptism by fire, competing against students who had traveled abroad, whose parents financed their projects without blinking. Nathan didn't resent them, he simply took note of the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to be. It was during those years he met Lucas Hale, a sharp-tongued finance student with a gift for making friends in every room. Lucas became the brother Nathan never had, the one who'd drag him to rooftop bars to network and then laugh when Nathan ended up sketching the skyline on a napkin instead. After graduation, Nathan discovered the cruel truth about the field he loved: talent didn't guarantee opportunity. He landed a few short-term gigs, drawing plans for small businesses or renovating brownstones, but the dream, opening his own firm, remained a far-off star. The economic downturn had shrunk budgets, and firms were hiring cautiously. He spent mornings emailing portfolios, afternoons consulting on minor remodels, and evenings sketching competition entries in the hope that one would get noticed. There were months when the rent came down to the last dollar in his account. Through it all, Margaret's voice echoed in his head: work with what you've got until you've got more to work with. He believed her, even on the days he doubted himself. And then came the library showcase, where he'd been invited to present a concept he'd entered in a civic design contest. He hadn't expected much, maybe a few polite questions, a nod from a local planner, but instead, he left with something else entirely: a conversation with a woman who understood the value of creating spaces where people could breathe. Meeting Elena wasn't in his blueprint for the day, yet as he lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, he realized he'd sketched her smile in the margin of his notes. He didn't know where that would lead, but he knew this much: she wasn't just another passerby in the city's crowded streets. The days following their meeting at the library unfolded like pages neither Nathan nor Elena had planned to read, yet neither could put down. It began with a simple text from Nathan: "You mentioned a boy who speaks in train whistles. Did he ever try steam engine for excitement?" Elena smiled when she read it, tapping back a reply that somehow turned into an hour-long exchange about childhood quirks, favorite coffee shops, and the best places to walk in Boston without feeling rushed. By the end of the week, they met for coffee at a small cafe tucked on a corner of Newberry Street, where mismatched mugs and the scent of cinnamon seemed to approve of the conversation. Elena talked about her work, how every child she met was like a puzzle with a unique key, how victories were measured in syllables and shy smiles. Nathan listened like every word mattered, asking questions that showed he wasn't just filling silence. In turn, he shared stories of his design work, the frustration of unresponsive clients, and the dream projects he sketched late at night. There was an ease between them, a rhythm that didn't have to be forced. When they left the cafe, they walked together without planning to, stopping at a bookstore where Elena picked out a collection of urban design essays and teased Nathan about reading homework before their next meeting. Over the next months, they became constants in each other's calendars, finding small ways to weave their worlds together. Saturdays sometimes meant helping Nathan take measurements at a renovation site, where Elena would watch him bend over blueprints with a pencil tucked behind his ear, explaining in layman's terms why an open courtyard could make people feel safer. Sundays could be hikes along the Middlesex Fells, where Nathan learned that Elena moved through nature the same way she did through conversation, attentive, noticing details others overlooked. She spoke about gardening the way he spoke about design, both driven by the belief that with care, things could be shaped into beauty. Nathan discovered she loved cooking in the same patient way she taught, layering flavors like she layered encouragement for her young patients. For Elena, Nathan's presence was like the architecture he admired, steady, intentional, leaving room for her to be herself. Even in their quietest moments, sitting on her couch with tea while rain drummed against the windows, there was no need to fill the air. It simply felt right. It was during this time that Sophie entered Nathan's orbit for the first time. Elena invited him to a family dinner at her parents' home, a warm house in the suburbs where the air always smelled faintly of rosemary and baked bread. Sophie arrived late, sweeping into the dining room in a fitted dress that seemed more suited for cocktails than roast chicken. She greeted Nathan with a smile that lingered a heartbeat too long and a compliment about his tie that made Elena chuckle under her breath. Throughout the evening, Sophie peppered him with questions about his projects, his travels, his favorite wines, leaning forward in a way that drew Robert's raised eyebrow and their mother's subtle change of subject. Nathan answered politely, oblivious to any undercurrent, while Elena focused on keeping the conversation balanced. Sophie's boyfriend, Evan, a laid-back musician with calloused fingertips, noticed the way Sophie's eyes followed Nathan a beat too long. Later, as they were leaving, he muttered to Elena, "Your sister's got a curious way of making new friends." Elena brushed it off, chalking it up to Sophie's usual charm, the same charm that had always made people forgive her sharp edges. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, quiet thought began to form, one she didn't name, because to name it would be to give it shape. 2 years of shared coffee cups, rainy day walks, and a slow-building trust brought Nathan and Elena to the White Mountains one crisp October weekend. The plan, as far as Elena knew, was to spend 2 days hiking trails dressed in gold and crimson, staying in a rustic cabin Nathan had found online. She didn't notice the small box tucked in the side pocket of his jacket or the way his hands stayed in his pockets a little longer than usual. On their second morning, after a breakfast of blueberry pancakes at a roadside diner, Nathan suggested they take the Franconia Ridge Loop, promising views worth the sore legs. They climbed in companionable silence, the air thin and fragrant with pine, until they reached a lookout where the valley stretched endlessly below them. There, Nathan pulled her close, heart hammering harder than the climb, and told her how meeting her had been like finding the blueprint he didn't know he'd been missing. He spoke about the way she looked at the world, how she listened, how she never made him feel less for what he hadn't yet achieved. Then he dropped to one knee, the diamond catching the sun, and asked if she'd build the rest of her life with him. Elena's yes came out as a laugh caught in tears, and in that moment, the mountain felt smaller than the space between them. The engagement party happened 2 weeks later in Elena's parents' backyard, strung with warm lights that made the October air feel softer. Margaret arrived with a homemade apple pie and hugged Elena like she just gained a daughter instead of losing a son to marriage. Lucas cracked jokes about Nathan finally closing a deal worth keeping, earning groans from everyone but Sophie, who laughed a little too warmly. Sophie's dress was just shy of white, her lipstick a bold crimson, and when she hugged Nathan, her hands lingered on his arms as she whispered something that made him smile, though Elena couldn't hear what. Robert's toast was a masterclass in sincerity, recounting the first time Nathan had joined them for Sunday dinner and predicting a lifetime of loyalty between the two. On the edges of the celebration, Sophie's boyfriend Evan kept his distance, his eyes tracking the easy familiarity between Sophie and Nathan with a frown that deepened as the night went on. As guests trickled out, Sophie made a dramatic exit, claiming she had an early photo shoot for a fashion blog she was trying to grow, leaving Evan behind to collect his things. He lingered near the dessert table with Elena, lowering his voice to say, "Watch her. She doesn't always play fair, even with family." Elena smiled tightly, brushing it off, unwilling to let shadows creep into a night meant for celebration. Nathan, oblivious to any undercurrent, was busy thanking guests and stealing glances at Elena like she was the only person there. Later, as they sat together on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill, Elena rested her head on his shoulder and let herself believe in the promise of the life they were about to build. The laughter, the soft lights, the warmth of his hand in hers, all of it felt unshakable. She couldn't yet know how fragile even the strongest foundations could be when pressure came from the cracks you never thought to look for. The morning of their wedding dawned with a sky so clear it seemed borrowed from a postcard, the kind of day that felt like a good omen. Elena woke in her childhood bedroom, the scent of lavender from the sachet in her nightstand drawer mingling with the faint aroma of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Her mother, Caroline, was already bustling downstairs, overseeing the last-minute preparations, while her father, Robert, was outside making sure the garden, where the cocktail hour would take place, looked perfect. Elena's gown, an elegant off-the-shoulder design with delicate lace along the train, hung near the window, catching the morning light. Bridesmaids laughed and clinked glasses of orange juice in the adjoining room, but Elena sat quietly for a moment, grounding herself in the enormity of what was about to happen. She thought about the years it had taken to arrive at this moment, the slow weaving of her and Nathan's lives together, and felt a quiet certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Sophie arrived mid-morning in a pale blush dress that seemed just a shade lighter than custom might allow, hugging Elena tightly but letting her perfume linger a little too heavily. "You look beautiful," she said, her tone sweet enough to pass, though there was something unreadable in her eyes. The ceremony took place at a renovated chapel in Cambridge, with tall stained-glass windows that bathed the pews in warm, jeweled light. Friends and family filled the space, their murmurs softening into silence as the music began. Nathan stood at the altar, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his expression open and unguarded as he watched Elena walk toward him. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, and Lucas gave Nathan a discreet thumbs-up when he thought no one was looking. The vows were heartfelt and unscripted, Nathan speaking about how Elena had taught him patience and perspective, and Elena describing how Nathan's dreams had inspired her to believe in her own. They exchanged rings, sealing promises forged in 2 years of shared trials and small triumphs. Sophie, seated in the front row with Evan, clapped enthusiastically but kept her gaze fixed on Nathan longer than seemed necessary. It was fleeting enough that most would dismiss it, but Evan noticed, his jaw tightening as he shifted in his seat. The reception was a blend of elegance and comfort, held in a hall strung with fairy lights and warmed by the scent of fresh flowers. Guests danced to a mix of classic soul and lively pop, plates overflowed with catered dishes, and the laughter was loud enough to make the space feel alive. Nathan and Elena swayed together during their first dance, smiling like they were the only two in the room. Sophie caught the bouquet during the traditional toss, an accident that drew a ripple of knowing laughter from some guests. Elena laughed too, but Evan didn't. He caught Sophie's smirk as she clutched the flowers, almost like a prize. Later, as the night wound down and Elena helped Nathan out of his jacket on the balcony, they talked quietly about the future, about saving for a home, about the children they hoped to have, about supporting each other's dreams no matter the setbacks. Neither of them noticed Sophie stepping out briefly to take a phone call, her voice low and her tone conspiratorial. For now, the newlyweds remained blissfully unaware, sealed in the fragile magic of their first night as husband and wife, with no inkling that the first hairline cracks in their foundation had already begun to form. The first year of marriage was a blend of warmth and adjustment, the kind that tested Nathan and Elena in ways neither had anticipated. Their small apartment in Cambridge became a cozy retreat, with mismatched furniture that carried stories from thrift stores and hand-me-downs from family. Elena's income as a children's speech therapist remained steady, covering most of their bills while Nathan navigated the uncertain terrain of his career. His junior architect role at a mid-tier firm was respectable but far from the creative autonomy he craved. The firm often relegated him to tedious drafting work for projects that lacked vision, strip malls, corporate interiors, nothing like the vibrant community spaces he dreamed of building. This began to wear on him, especially as peers from school posted their breakthroughs on social media. Elena tried to be his anchor, making their home a place of respite. She'd greet him with dinner ready, sometimes trying new recipes, other times letting takeout boxes fill the kitchen counter while they sat cross-legged on the floor eating and talking. But beneath the comfort, Nathan felt the creeping weight of inadequacy. The occasional argument started small, over household chores or weekend plans, but often ended with Nathan quietly retreating into himself. By the third year, finances had tightened further. Elena picked up additional clients at the clinic to supplement their income, often working late into the evenings. Her dedication to her work sometimes meant she was exhausted by the time she came home, which Nathan interpreted as emotional distance. He, in turn, began staying longer at the office, telling himself it was for overtime pay, though some nights he simply lingered at a coffee shop or wandered the city to avoid confronting his own frustration. Into this fragile rhythm stepped Sophie. Now single after her breakup with Evan, she started appearing more frequently, offering to help out in small ways. She'd drop by with Nathan's favorite snacks, offer to run errands for him when Elena was swamped, and even bring coffee to his office under the guise of being nearby. Her presence felt casual on the surface, but there was a subtle undercurrent, her compliments always just a touch too personal, her questions leaning into Nathan's career frustrations in ways that made him open up more than he should have. Elena noticed the frequency of Sophie's visits but dismissed them at first. She told herself that her sister was simply trying to be more involved, perhaps even making amends for past selfishness. Sophie had a way of being disarmingly charming, making it difficult to accuse her of overstepping without sounding paranoid. Still, small moments began to trouble Elena, a lingering hand on Nathan's arm when Sophie laughed, the way Sophie always seemed to know where Nathan would be without Elena telling her. Nathan didn't see it, or perhaps didn't want to. He appreciated the attention, especially when his own wife seemed too busy or tired to sit and listen to his daily complaints. It wasn't that Elena didn't care, she cared deeply, but her energy was split between supporting their home financially and caring for her patients. She assumed Nathan understood the sacrifices she was making for both of them. But Sophie, ever perceptive, had begun to recognize the quiet fault lines in their marriage, and she was patient. She didn't push too hard, she simply lingered at the edges, waiting for the right moment to step in. What Elena didn't yet realize was that her sister's version of help came with a long game, one that would feed on those fault lines until the foundation of her marriage began to shift under her feet. Winter had settled over Boston with the kind of cold that cut straight through wool coats when the call came. Nathan was in the middle of reviewing floor plans at the office when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. On the other end was a crisp-voiced attorney from a New York law firm, informing him that his father, Gregory Carter, had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. For a moment, Nathan's mind went completely still. He hadn't spoken to Gregory in over 20 years, not since the man walked out on Margaret and their 6-year-old son, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and unanswered questions. His memories of his father were fragmented, flashes of deep laughter at the dinner table, the smell of aftershave, the sound of an argument one night that ended with a slamming door and silence that lasted decades. Gregory had remarried twice, each time climbing higher in the real estate development world, and Nathan had learned to stop wondering if the man ever thought about him. Now, with this call, there was no time left for wondering. The attorney explained that Gregory's estate was substantial, and Nathan was, to his shock, named as a beneficiary. It was a revelation Nathan could barely process, tangled in resentment, confusion, and a strange, reluctant curiosity. When Nathan shared the news with Elena that evening, she listened in silence, her expression unreadable at first. "How do you feel about it?" she asked finally, her voice gentle. He shrugged, pouring himself a drink he didn't touch. "I don't know. Angry. Sad. Maybe even relieved. And now this money, this inheritance, I don't even know if I want it." Elena put her hand on his, reminding him that whatever complicated history he had with Gregory, the choice of what to do with the inheritance could be his way of reclaiming some control. Margaret, however, had a different reaction when Nathan told her. She was wary, her eyes narrowing as she said, "Money from him won't erase what he did. And it won't fix anything if you're not careful with it. Just remember, wealth has a way of attracting the wrong kind of people." It was advice that Nathan took in but didn't fully absorb, not yet. The days following the call were a blur of legal documents, meetings with estate managers, and conversations with lawyers who spoke in a language that seemed to reduce grief into percentages and property valuations. Nathan learned that Gregory had owned multiple high-end properties, a collection of rare art, and held significant shares in a luxury development company. His will, surprisingly straightforward, left a portion of his fortune to Nathan outright, with no stipulations. To Nathan's quiet astonishment, Gregory had even left a handwritten letter, brief but loaded with implications. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope this can help you build something of your own. That sentence replayed in Nathan's mind late at night, mingling with old memories and unanswered questions. Meanwhile, word of the inheritance began to ripple subtly through their circle. Lucas raised an eyebrow but kept his thoughts to himself, while Sophie's interest was immediate and intense. She stopped by under the pretense of checking in on Nathan, offering sympathy that felt just a shade too rehearsed. "Family's complicated," she said, her gaze lingering on him. "But maybe this is a chance to change everything." Elena watched the exchange quietly, unaware that her sister's idea of change was nothing like her own. The weeks after Gregory's funeral were marked by a peculiar shift in Nathan's world. Meetings with lawyers and accountants became routine, and the looming certainty of his inheritance cast a shadow over his daily life. He hadn't yet decided how to use it, whether to invest, start his long-dreamed-of firm, or pay off debts, but the possibilities kept him awake at night. Sophie, who had attended the funeral draped in a chic black coat and offering comfort to Nathan in a way that felt just a little too intimate, began inserting herself more frequently into his days. She would text him about articles on luxury properties, offer to connect him with friends in real estate, or drop by with coffee since I was in the neighborhood. At first, her presence felt harmless, supportive even, but Elena noticed how Sophie's conversations with Nathan often steered toward his frustrations, his ambitions, and the ways she believed Elena might be too busy to fully appreciate what he was going through. It started subtly. Sophie would mention things Elena had supposedly said in passing, small complaints about Nathan's spending habits or his long hours. She'd frame them as though she were reluctantly sharing them, out of concern for his feelings. "I probably shouldn't say this," she'd begin, eyes soft with feigned reluctance, "but Elena told me she worries you might be wasting your potential. I just think you deserve to know how she really feels." Nathan, caught between confusion and irritation, tried to brush these comments off, but they burrowed into his mind. Then came the more direct suggestions. Over drinks one afternoon, Nathan had invited Sophie to meet after she claimed she wanted to brainstorm ideas for his future. She told him she thought Elena didn't understand the scope of his dreams. "She's wonderful, Nathan," Sophie said, leaning forward with sincerity, "but she's rooted in safety. You're meant for more than safe." Elena remained unaware of the specifics, though she felt the shift in Nathan's mood. He was more distracted, his responses clipped, his patience thinner than before. When she asked about his day, he'd give vague answers, sometimes mentioning Sophie in casual tones that belied the frequency of their meetings. One evening, Elena walked into the living room to find Sophie perched on the arm of Nathan's chair, laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Sophie stood quickly when she saw Elena, offering an overly bright smile and an excuse about just stopping by to see how Nathan's plans were coming along. Elena didn't confront her, she told herself it was nothing, but a quiet unease began to take root. Sophie, meanwhile, was patient in her plotting. She didn't push Nathan toward outright disloyalty yet. Instead, she cultivated his trust, positioning herself as the one who truly understood him. Each carefully placed lie, each insinuation, was a brick in the wall she was building between Nathan and Elena, one that, soon enough, Elena wouldn't see over. The day the inheritance was finalized felt strangely anticlimactic. There was no grand ceremony, no dramatic moment, just a signature on thick legal paper in a conference room with a skyline view, followed by the steady slide of bank notifications that confirmed Nathan Carter's life had changed forever. The figures were staggering, several million in liquid assets, a luxury downtown condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, and controlling shares in a real estate development company. Nathan sat in stunned silence, his pen still in hand, as the lawyer detailed the assets like reading from a grocery list. The condo keys, heavy in his palm, felt less like property and more like possibility. Walking out of that building, Boston felt different beneath his feet, its streets sharper, its corners more inviting. For years he had been looking up at the towers, sketching their lines in the margins of his notebooks. Now, one of those towers belonged to him. Almost immediately, his demeanor began to shift. It wasn't arrogance, at least not at first, but a quiet confidence that hummed under his skin. He upgraded his wardrobe, traded in his old sedan for a sleek black coupe, and began attending networking events that once seemed out of reach. Sophie's presence at these events became a regular occurrence. Whenever Elena couldn't join due to her clinic work, Sophie would volunteer to accompany Nathan, claiming it was important to have someone there who believed in his vision. She slipped seamlessly into the role of social ally, introducing him to developers, art gallery owners, and wealthy acquaintances who seemed charmed by her quick wit and poise. Nathan appreciated her adaptability, telling himself it was purely professional, though he noticed how easily she fit into this new chapter of his life. Elena watched these changes with a mix of pride and unease. She wanted to celebrate Nathan's success, to encourage him to pursue his ambitions, but there was something in the pace of it all that unsettled her. The downtown condo was beautiful but felt impersonal, its sharp edges and glass walls a far cry from the cozy warmth of their Cambridge apartment. Nathan insisted they keep the apartment for now, claiming it was easier than moving in the middle of his work projects, but Elena suspected he liked having a space that was entirely his. When she couldn't attend an important charity gala with him because of a late clinic emergency, she later saw a photo online, Nathan in a tuxedo, Sophie in an emerald gown at his side, the two of them laughing in a way that suggested familiarity far beyond casual. Nathan brushed it off when she mentioned it, saying Sophie had simply been there to support him. Still, the image stayed with Elena like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore, as if foreshadowing a fracture she couldn't yet see but already felt forming. It began with little things, shifts so slight they could almost be explained away. Nathan started answering Elena's questions with distracted half-sentences, scrolling through his phone while she spoke. He no longer asked about her day at the clinic or the progress of her most challenging patients. Instead, he'd launch into stories about people she didn't know, new business associates, potential investors, the big names Sophie had introduced him to. When Elena suggested they spend a quiet weekend together at the cabin in the White Mountains, the place where they had gotten engaged, Nathan claimed he was too busy with important meetings. Those meetings, Elena noticed, often coincided with events Sophie also attended. On the nights he came home late, he smelled faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, though she told herself it was likely from being in crowded rooms. Yet the unease grew, not because of a single glaring red flag, but because of the slow erosion of intimacy, like sand slipping from beneath her feet before she realized she was in deep water. The tension reached a point where ignoring it was no longer possible. One Thursday evening, after Nathan arrived home later than usual, Elena confronted him in the kitchen. "We barely talk anymore, Nathan. You're somewhere else even when you're right here." He set his briefcase down and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "I'm working hard for us, Elena. I'm trying to build something bigger than the life we've had." She frowned. "Since when wasn't our life enough?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Since I realized we could have more, but you're comfortable staying in the same place. Sophie gets it. She pushes me to think bigger." The mention of Sophie's name in that context felt like a slap, the casual insertion of her sister into the intimate space of their marriage. Elena's chest tightened, but before she could respond, Nathan grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and retreated to the living room, leaving her staring at the kitchen tiles as if they could anchor her. Outside their home, the cracks were visible to others. Lucas, who had always been blunt with Nathan, called him out over drinks one night. "You're spending too much time with Sophie. People notice, man." Elena notices. Nathan brushed him off with a shrug, insisting it was harmless, that Sophie was just helping with networking. Meanwhile, Hannah Pierce, Elena's closest friend since college, voiced her concern over brunch. "I know she's your sister, but Sophie's enjoying this new role way too much. She's making herself indispensable to Nathan, and that's dangerous." Elena wanted to believe Hannah was being overprotective, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. When she returned home that afternoon, she found Sophie's scarf draped over the back of Nathan's office chair, the scent of her expensive perfume clinging to the air. Nathan wasn't home, and Elena stood there, holding the scarf, wondering just how much of her life was still truly hers, and how much had already been quietly rewritten by someone she had grown up trusting. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Sophie delivered the blow that would tip Nathan's wavering trust into freefall. She arrived at the downtown condo under the guise of bringing him documents from a contact in the development industry. They sat in the sleek, cold kitchen with glasses of wine, Sophie's voice soft and sympathetic as she leaned closer. "Nathan," she began, hesitating just enough to seem reluctant, "I saw something the other day. I think you deserve to know." She told him she'd passed by a trendy cafe near Elena's clinic and spotted Elena sitting in the corner with a man. Sophie painted the picture in careful strokes, how they'd been leaning in close, how Elena had touched the man's hand, how the man had smiled in a way that wasn't professional. When Nathan asked who it was, Sophie claimed not to know, but suggested it looked more intimate than just colleagues. She didn't stop there. Later that night, she followed up with a series of screenshots she claimed to have accidentally found on social media, messages between Elena and the man, pulled from a fake account she had created. The texts, edited and taken out of context, hinted at meetings, private jokes, and vague but suggestive phrases. To Nathan, who had already been primed by months of Sophie's insinuations, the pieces began to form a story that made painful sense. The next day, Nathan returned home with a stiffness in his manner that Elena couldn't quite read. She greeted him with her usual smile, but his responses were short, his eyes lingering on her as if searching for something. She asked if he was all right, but he brushed it off, claiming he was tired from meetings. In truth, his mind was replaying Sophie's words and those damning screenshots on an endless loop. Every late night Elena had spent at the clinic, every work call she'd taken in another room, every casual mention of a male colleague, all of it now felt suspicious in the shadow of what he thought he knew. Instead of confronting her directly, Nathan withdrew further, locking his phone when she was near, taking calls on the balcony, and spending more time at the condo under the pretense of working late. Elena sensed the change but couldn't understand its cause, and every attempt to bridge the distance seemed to fall into a widening gap between them. Outside their marriage, the ripple effects began to spread. Lucas noticed the way Nathan avoided discussing Elena, sidestepping questions with vague comments about needing space. Hannah noticed Elena's growing restlessness, the way she picked at her food during their lunch dates and stared out the window as if waiting for something to happen. One evening, after Elena mentioned she hadn't seen Nathan in person for several days, Hannah asked outright if she thought there was someone else. Elena shook her head immediately, but the truth was she didn't know anymore. She trusted Nathan, or at least, she had, but the man she married seemed to be fading, replaced by someone who kept secrets and looked at her like a stranger. That night, as rain battered the windows of their Cambridge apartment, Nathan sat alone in the condo, staring at the city lights and telling himself he was doing the right thing by staying quiet. Sophie's lies had done their work, doubt had taken root so deeply that the truth no longer felt like a possibility worth considering. It happened without warning, as if Nathan had been rehearsing the scene in his head for weeks and finally decided to deliver it without an audience to object. Elena returned home one Friday evening, carrying a bag of groceries and humming softly, only to find Nathan already there, standing in the living room, a manila envelope on the coffee table. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold in a way that made her stomach tighten. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. She set the groceries down slowly, sensing something irreversible in the air. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, he told her he was filing for divorce. There was no discussion, no attempt to explain beyond vague accusations of betrayal and losing trust. When she demanded to know where this was coming from, he shook his head, refusing to elaborate, as if speaking the details aloud would somehow diminish the conviction he clung to. She tried to reach for him, to demand an actual conversation, but he stepped back. "I can't do this anymore, Elena. It's over." And with that, he left, no raised voice, no slammed door, just a quiet exit that felt far crueler. The following week, the humiliation deepened when Elena learned from a mutual acquaintance that Nathan had moved Sophie into the downtown condo. The news hit her like a physical blow, each word a shard she couldn't dislodge. She didn't want to believe it until she saw it for herself, Sophie's social media posts from inside the condo, artfully cropped but unmistakable in their location. There she was, posing on the balcony with the skyline glittering behind her, smiling over wine at the kitchen island Elena had once dreamed of using for family dinners. The betrayal was twofold, not just the end of her marriage, but the realization that her own sister had orchestrated it. Friends reacted with shock and anger. Hannah was livid, urging Elena to confront Sophie publicly, while Lucas cornered Nathan at a networking event and told him flatly, "You've made the biggest mistake of your life." Margaret, devastated by her son's actions, stopped speaking to him entirely, refusing to condone what she called a disgrace. Elena, meanwhile, moved through the days in a haze, each step feeling heavier than the last. The apartment they'd shared became suffocating with memories, so she began packing boxes without knowing exactly where she would go. At night, she'd lie awake replaying the past months, searching for the moment she should have seen this coming, the exact point where love had turned to suspicion and suspicion to betrayal. She thought about Sophie's smiles that never reached her eyes, the perfume lingering on Nathan's clothes, the way his touch had grown absent before his body did. And still, beneath the grief, there was a thread of disbelief. How could the man she'd built a life with, the one who had promised to stand beside her through every storm, believe lies so easily? It was a question she would carry for a long time, though in that moment, she only knew one thing: the world she had trusted was gone, dismantled by the two people she should have been able to trust most. And in the hollow space they left behind, something new began to stir, an ember of resolve that, though small now, would one day burn bright enough to light her way out. The first week after moving out was the hardest. Elena found herself in a small rented cottage near the sea, its whitewashed walls and drafty windows a far cry from the apartment she and Nathan had once called home. The ocean air carried a constant chill, even in early spring, and at night, the sound of waves against the rocks felt both soothing and unbearably lonely. She unpacked her life slowly, one box at a time, choosing to leave some things taped shut because the memories they contained were still too raw. Gone were the framed photographs from their wedding, the silly candid shots from their hikes, the drawings Nathan used to make for her just for fun. Now her shelves held only what she had brought from her parents' home, a few treasured books, a mug her mother had given her, and a small potted fern that she watered religiously, telling herself that if the plant could survive a move, so could she. Work became her anchor, though even that came with its challenges. She took on extra clients at the clinic to cover rent and expenses, often working until her voice was hoarse from hours of patient sessions. The children she worked with didn't know about her heartbreak. They only saw her as the patient, smiling therapist who celebrated their progress and encouraged their smallest efforts. Yet when she returned home, exhaustion would settle over her like a heavy coat, and she'd sometimes sit on the cottage steps staring at the sea until the cold forced her inside. It was during one of these evenings that she received an unexpected email from Dr. Alan Reeves, her old college mentor. He had read about her recent work in a professional newsletter and wanted to reconnect. His message was simple but carried a weight she didn't realize she needed. Elena, your dedication to your patients has always been extraordinary. Have you ever thought about opening your own practice? That single line planted a seed in her mind. The thought of starting fresh, of creating something entirely her own, began to take root alongside the grief. She wasn't ready to move on from the betrayal, not yet, but she could feel a shift in her thinking. Nathan and Sophie had taken so much from her, but they had not taken her skills, her compassion, or her drive. For the first time since the divorce papers were filed, Elena felt a spark of possibility. She began researching small business loans, jotting down ideas for how her clinic could be different from the others in the city. And as she stood one morning with the ocean breeze in her hair, she realized that while her old life had crumbled, the foundation beneath her was still solid. It was hers, and she would rebuild, not for revenge, but for herself. Life inside the downtown condo had transformed Sophie into a version of herself she had always imagined but never been able to sustain. She relished the marble counters, the endless city views, and the feeling of being in the center of Nathan's new, moneyed world. Dressed in tailored outfits and designer heels, she attended galas, charity dinners, and exclusive networking events at his side, introducing herself as Nathan Carter's partner with a pride that bordered on possessive. To their social circle, Sophie appeared radiant, confident, and utterly comfortable in her new role. Yet behind the closed doors of the condo, cracks were already beginning to form. Sophie had an expensive taste for both luxury goods and attention. She ordered designer clothes by the armload, spent afternoons at spas, and hired private chefs on a whim, often without consulting Nathan. He brushed it off at first, telling himself that she was simply adjusting to a new lifestyle, but the bills stacking in his office drawer told a different story. Nathan, for his part, was enjoying the professional benefits of having Sophie on his arm. Her charisma made her a natural conversationalist, and she had a knack for remembering details about potential clients that made them feel valued. Still, something about her growing influence nagged at him. She began subtly discouraging him from seeing certain friends, especially Lucas, who had never hidden his dislike for her. "He doesn't support you the way I do," Sophie would say with a tilt of her head, framing herself as the only person truly in Nathan's corner. She even tried to limit his contact with Margaret, suggesting that his mother was too critical and didn't understand his success. Nathan dismissed these as small issues, yet deep down, he felt an undercurrent of unease whenever Sophie spoke about the people who had been constants in his life long before she arrived. While Nathan was slow to see the warning signs, others noticed. Lucas heard about Sophie's lavish spending habits from a mutual acquaintance and grew even more suspicious of her motives. Hannah, who had distanced herself from Nathan after the divorce, confided to Elena that Sophie's public image as Nathan's devoted partner didn't match the gossip circulating in certain social circles. Even Margaret, usually reserved in her opinions, couldn't hide her disapproval when she saw Sophie's dismissive behavior toward the staff at a charity event. Nathan, however, was not yet ready to face the truth. He told himself he had made the right choice, that Sophie was loyal in ways Elena had never been, because that's what Sophie had convinced him to believe. But beneath the surface of his denial, small doubts were beginning to gather like clouds before a storm, waiting for the moment when even he could no longer ignore them. The decision to start her own practice didn't come overnight, but once Elena committed to it, she threw herself into the process with a determination that surprised even her. Her evenings, once spent nursing quiet grief, were now filled with business planning, researching locations, and meeting with potential investors. Dr. Alan Reeves became both mentor and ally, guiding her through the maze of permits, staffing, and budgeting. She found a quaint but spacious storefront in a historic neighborhood, a place with wide windows that let in morning light and enough room to create both therapy spaces and a warm reception area. The building needed work, but Elena saw what it could become. She negotiated a reasonable lease, hired a small but passionate team, and began the renovations. Every decision, from the color of the walls to the child-friendly furniture, reflected her vision, a space where children could feel safe, empowered, and celebrated. The day the sign Harbor Speech and Language Center went up, she stood on the sidewalk with a quiet smile, feeling a sense of ownership over her life that she hadn't felt in years. Word spread quickly in the community. Parents who had once known her from the clinic began recommending her to friends, and soon her calendar filled faster than she'd anticipated. She hosted open house days with interactive activities for kids, turning the center into a local hub for families. Local media even featured her in a Women in Business spotlight, praising her dedication and personal touch. One of her proudest moments came when she received an award from the Boston Early Education Network for her innovative therapy programs. She hung the certificate in the reception area, not as a boast, but as a reminder to herself of how far she had come from the lonely nights in her seaside cottage. Each success added a layer of confidence, slowly replacing the pain Nathan and Sophie had left behind. And though she didn't seek revenge, Elena was aware that the best retribution often came quietly, in the form of a life rebuilt stronger than before. Ironically, her newfound success brought her into indirect competition with Nathan. One of his latest architectural projects, a modern community building in the same historic district, was set to be considered for the same neighborhood improvement award her renovated practice had been nominated for. Elena learned of it through a local bulletin, her heart giving an odd, quick twist at the mention of his name. She didn't reach out to him, nor did she plan to. Still, the possibility that their paths might cross again stirred something in her, a mix of curiosity, unease, and resolve. This time, she would meet his gaze, not as the betrayed wife he left behind, but as a woman who had built something of her own, without his money, his name, or his approval. Whatever recognition came from the award would be hers alone, and that truth was worth more than any trophy. For Nathan, the sheen of his new life with Sophie began to dull in ways he couldn't ignore. At first, he had chalked it up to stress from work, the late nights preparing proposals, the pressure of balancing his inheritance projects with maintaining the development firm's reputation. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. Sophie was not the partner he had imagined she would be. Her temper was quick, surfacing in sharp comments to waitstaff or dismissive gestures toward people she deemed unimportant. She had a habit of treating Nathan's successes as her own and his setbacks as failures he had brought upon them both. More than once, she scolded him for letting people walk over him when he tried to accommodate a client's budget, insisting he should aim higher, demand more, and think less about community benefit. These disagreements were small sparks at first, but they accumulated into a tension Nathan could feel every time they shared the condo's glossy, echoing rooms. The first real fracture came at a dinner party hosted by a prominent developer. Nathan had been excited about the evening. It was an opportunity to present a new concept he believed could revitalize underused public spaces in the city. But during the dinner, as he spoke with a potential investor, Sophie interrupted with a laugh that felt too loud and a comment that undermined his idea. "Nathan's projects are sweet," she said with a patronizing smile, "but sometimes he forgets that vision doesn't pay the bills." The table erupted in polite chuckles, but Nathan felt the sting. On the drive home, he confronted her, asking why she had said it. Sophie rolled her eyes, claiming it was just a joke and that he needed to stop being so sensitive. Her dismissive tone settled over him like a weight, leaving him awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring out at the city skyline and wondering when exactly her presence had gone from intoxicating to suffocating. The turning point came one late afternoon when Nathan returned to the condo unexpectedly after a canceled meeting. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard Sophie's voice, low, conspiratorial, speaking on the phone in the kitchen. He paused just before the doorway, catching the unmistakable edge of arrogance in her words. "Of course I played him. Do you think I'd be living here if I hadn't? Elena was never right for him, but he never would have left her if I didn't give him a little push." Nathan froze, the blood roaring in his ears as Sophie laughed softly and added, "He'll never know the full story. Men like him never want to admit they were fooled." She hung up before he could collect himself, but the damage was instant. In that moment, the narrative he'd clung to for months, that Elena had betrayed him, that Sophie was the one who understood him, shattered like glass underfoot. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he walked silently to his office, closed the door, and sat in the dark, replaying every conversation, every concern Sophie had ever voiced about Elena. For the first time, he began to see the possibility that he hadn't just made a mistake, he had destroyed the one thing in his life that had been real. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office chair long after the city lights faded into the gray wash of dawn, sifting through every memory with Elena that Sophie had once poisoned with her whispers. The pieces began to fit in a way that made him sick, how Sophie had happened to see Elena with a man, how she'd framed harmless situations as evidence of betrayal, how her comfort had always seemed to appear exactly when he was most frustrated with his marriage. By morning, anger and shame tangled inside him, but he knew emotions alone weren't enough. He needed proof, not just to confront Sophie, but to face the truth about the woman he had walked away from. Swallowing his pride, he called Lucas, his voice hoarse. "I need your help," he said simply. Lucas, though skeptical, agreed to meet, and when Nathan told him everything, his friend's expression hardened. "I've been telling you for months Sophie's no good. But if you want to dig, I'll dig." Lucas's first call was to Hannah, knowing she'd have insights into Elena's life and the timeline Sophie had warped. Hannah didn't hesitate to cooperate. She remembered dates, events, and conversations Sophie had twisted when relaying them to Nathan. More importantly, she still had screenshots of her own, messages from Elena about working late, planning therapy sessions, and attending professional conferences, all on the night Sophie had claimed Elena was meeting another man. Lucas took the information to a mutual acquaintance in IT, who managed to trace the mystery messages Sophie had shown Nathan. It didn't take long to discover they came from a fake account, registered under an email Sophie had created. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the days Sophie had conveniently been checking in with Nathan about Elena's supposed infidelity. Nathan stared at the evidence until the lines blurred. The weight of it was crushing, proof that he had ended his marriage, broken the trust of the only woman who had stood by him during his worst years, all because he had believed the lies of someone he thought he could trust. He remembered Elena's face during their last conversation, the way her voice had cracked when she asked what she had done wrong, and how he had turned away instead of answering. Now, every accusation he had made against her echoed back at him like an indictment against himself. Lucas, never one to soften the truth, put it plainly, "You didn't just get played, Nathan. You burned the bridge yourself and handed her the matches." And for the first time since the divorce, Nathan allowed himself to imagine that maybe Elena had never stopped loving him, he had simply made it impossible for her to stay. Nathan spent the next few days in a restless haze, torn between the urgency to make things right and the dread of knowing it might already be too late. Every time he picked up his phone to call Elena, he hesitated, unsure if she would even answer. In the end, he decided seeing her face-to-face was the only way to explain everything. On a sunny Saturday morning, he drove to the Harbor Speech and Language Center, his palms sweating as he parked across the street. Through the wide front windows, he saw her kneeling beside a small boy, encouraging him with patient words that made the child beam when he succeeded. The sight hit him harder than expected. This was the Elena he had once known so intimately, the one who poured herself into everything she cared about. When their eyes finally met through the glass, surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by guarded caution. She stood, excused herself from her session, and stepped outside. "What are you doing here, Nathan?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. He started with an apology, the words tumbling out faster than he could control. He told her everything, how Sophie had lied, how the evidence proved she had fabricated the affair, how he had been wrong in every possible way. Elena listened in silence, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she let the silence hang between them until it was almost unbearable. "Do you have any idea what you took from me?" she finally said. "It wasn't just the marriage, Nathan. You made me question my worth, my integrity, and you let my own sister destroy me while you stood by her side." He flinched at the truth in her words. "I know," he said softly. "I want to make it right." But Elena shook her head, her voice steady. "You can't undo what's been done. You can only live with it." Before he could respond, a man approached from the corner, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile. "Hey, you ready for lunch?" he asked Elena, kissing her on the cheek. "Nathan, this is Michael Turner," Elena said, introducing them with a tone that was polite but distant. "Michael, Nathan." Michael extended a hand, and Nathan shook it mechanically, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. Michael's warm familiarity with Elena spoke volumes Nathan didn't need explained. As they walked away together, Nathan stood rooted on the sidewalk, watching them disappear down the street. He had come hoping for a second chance, but instead, he had been given a different kind of clarity. Some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt, no matter how much you wanted to cross them again. Sophie's undoing began not with a confrontation, but with a whisper. Lucas, determined to see her exposed, had quietly gathered every piece of incriminating evidence, recordings, emails, screenshots, and waited for the right moment to let it surface. That moment came at the annual Boston Real Estate Gala, an event Nathan had once attended with pride. This year, he arrived alone, wearing the same tailored navy suit from his wedding, a symbolic choice he knew Sophie would recognize. The ballroom glimmered with crystal chandeliers and the low hum of high-stakes networking. Sophie, dressed in a deep crimson gown, floated through the crowd like she owned the place, her laughter carrying just enough to draw attention. Midway through the evening, as she stood on stage to introduce a key sponsor, a sudden audio playback crackled through the sound system, her voice, unmistakable, dripping with smug confidence. "Of course I played him. Do you think I'd be living here if I hadn't? Elena was never right for him, but he never would have left her if I didn't give him a little push." The room fell into a stunned silence before the murmurs began, rising like a wave. Sophie froze, the microphone in her hand trembling slightly. The recording continued. "He'll never know the full story. Men like him never want to admit they were fooled." Faces turned toward Nathan, then back to Sophie, their expressions shifting from curiosity to judgment. She stammered, trying to laugh it off as a cruel fabrication, but Lucas stepped forward from the crowd, holding his phone high. "This isn't the only recording," he announced. "But it's enough for tonight." Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and within minutes, Sophie's carefully curated image was unraveling in real time. The event organizers quietly escorted her off stage, though the damage was already irreparable. By the next morning, the gossip pages and social media feeds were saturated with the story. Clients she had courted now wanted nothing to do with her, friends stopped returning calls, and the condo that had once been her prize became a suffocating reminder of her fall. Nathan didn't speak to her again after that night, though she tried, first with tearful voicemails, then with venomous texts blaming him for turning everyone against her. But she knew, deep down, that her own greed and arrogance had orchestrated her demise. Within weeks, Sophie sold off her remaining valuables, breaking her lease at the condo and leaving Boston without a forwarding address. No one knew exactly where she went, and few cared. Nathan, standing at the condo's window one last time, watched the city lights flicker and fade, wondering how different his life might have been if he'd seen through her sooner, and knowing that some mistakes carve their lessons so deep, they never fully fade. Elena's wedding day to Michael Turner unfolded under a wide expanse of blue sky along the Massachusetts coastline, the salty breeze carrying the scent of the ocean into every corner of the seaside garden they had chosen. The guests, an intimate gathering of friends, family, and colleagues, sat in white chairs that formed a semicircle around an archway draped with wildflowers. Elena stood beneath it, her gown simple yet elegant, a soft lace veil lifting gently with the wind. Michael, in a light gray suit, smiled at her with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the value of patience and commitment. Hannah stood as Elena's maid of honor, her pride evident in every glance. Even Margaret was there, seated in the front row, her expression warm and approving. The vows were tender and personal, filled with promises rooted not in grand gestures but in steady, everyday devotion. As Michael spoke of the life they would build together, Elena felt no ghosts of the past lingering, only the certainty that this was where her story had always been leading. After the ceremony, the reception spilled onto a deck overlooking the water, where tables were adorned with seashells and soft candles. Guests mingled over fresh seafood and champagne, laughter blending with the sound of waves against the shore. Elena found herself surrounded by love in its purest form, friends who had stood by her during her darkest days, family members who had supported her dreams, and a man who had walked into her life without conditions or ulterior motives. The Harbor Speech and Language Center was thriving, with a second location already in the works, and her days were now filled with purpose rather than pain. As she danced with Michael under strings of warm lights, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't believed possible after the betrayal. The pain was not erased, but it had been transformed, woven into the fabric of a life richer and more resilient than the one she had lost. From a distance, leaning against the railing near the edge of the deck, Nathan watched. He hadn't been invited, but he had found his way there anyway, drawn by the need to see for himself that she was truly happy. When Elena's gaze met his across the crowd, there was no bitterness, only a calm recognition. She offered him a small nod before turning back to Michael, her hand fitting easily into her husband's. Nathan stayed a moment longer, the sound of their laughter carrying across the water, before walking away into the night. Her final words to him months earlier echoed in his mind, "I promised you'd regret it. Now you do." And though regret weighed heavily on him, he understood something new. Her life was no longer a chapter in his story. It was her own, and she was writing it beautifully. The end.